Thank you for John's introduction. My name is Paul O'Neill. I'm a planning consultant with a company called Metropolis Planning and Design. We've been retained by TRAG for probably about a year now and have been acting in assisting the preparation of objections, advice on the content of the various planning applications, and carrying those objections forward to the local authority in consultation with the members of TRAG. I'm tasked this evening with outlining to you, those of you, I'm sure a lot of you do know what's been happening. There may be some here who don't, but I'm just going to very quickly run through some of the policy background, planning policy background that is, the planning applications that have been submitted by Solum, what's happened to them, and some of the actions that TRAG has been taking. I'm aware it's a very dry topic. Planning consultant is never a popular thing to introduce yourself as at parties, but I'll try and do it very quickly, and we can get on with looking at the other alternatives. I suppose the thing to bear in mind before we start is the basis of the town planning system that we have here in the UK. One fundamental sentence sums it up, and it's enshrined in law, and that is that local authorities are obliged to determine planning applications in accordance with their policies unless material considerations indicate otherwise. What we've got here, that I'll just quickly run through, is the evolution of some of those policies coinciding with the submission of the various planning applications. The best way to do that is actually through a timeline. So, there we go. Start with a chronology of events. That's basically what I'm going to be talking about this evening. So it runs from November 2008 through to November 2011, a lengthy process. That's the way planning works, unfortunately. So if I can ask you to cast your mind back to November 2008, while Lehman Brothers was busy collapsing, Richmond Council was in receipt of its tall building strategy, which was a report prepared by independent consultants on behalf of the council, and it looked at identifying locations within the borough where tall buildings may be appropriate. Now, the area you've got outlined on the plan there is the area around Twickenham Station. There was a similar area identified around Richmond Station, and one of the things to note here is that this area is actually, it's quite a large net to cast. And it also includes the most significant tall building in Twickenham, which is, for better or worse, Regal House. Therefore, if you're identifying an area where other tall buildings may be acceptable, that's the first port of call. Now, this really is the document that started all the trouble, because if you write something along the lines of this is an area where tall buildings may be acceptable, and you pass that on to an architect or a developer, these are the sort of schemes that they'll come back with in the first instance. Now, this is one of Solum's initial proposals for the redevelopment of Twickenham Station. I haven't drawn these myself. These are actually included in the environmental impact assessment that was submitted with the application. It's an exercise that the applicants are obliged to go through. This was the architect's first stab back in November 2008. And an image of it to follow, hopefully. Oops, there you go. As you can see, pretty high density stuff. This scheme evolved, I suppose, over the course of a couple of months into what you essentially see in the applications that are in front of you now. The podium deck emerged in November 2009, and it hasn't gone away. I suppose part of the point that I'm trying to make here, and I think it's a point that John picked up on in introduction, is that from the outset, the applicants, Solum, have been looking at a scheme that has a podium deck that covers a large proportion of the tracks and builds on top of it. Their initial scheme that went on top of it, again, where we're going back to February 2010, that's Cole Park Road in the foreground there. And I think that one was about 15 stories high. But the footprint of the buildings that you see there is actually replicated in the scheme that's been brought forward. They've had a bit of a haircut since that particular point in time, but essentially the footprint is the same. No option was ever considered that didn't have a podium, or certainly that's not an option that's ever been included in the environmental assessment that's been submitted. Next point on our timeline, the Council's adoption of their LDF core strategy. This is a planning policy document, if you remember the phrase I mentioned earlier, to determine planning applications in accordance with policy. This is the first step along that policy ladder. Richmond adopted their core strategy, pretty early adopter really in terms of other London boroughs, one of the first to do so. Included in that, this is the dry bit, are a number of policies, two to mention, CP7 and CP9. CP7 looks at protecting local character. CP9 is specifically Twickenham Town Centre. Now, included in the core strategy, again, and potentially offering encouragement to applicants, is that subject to CP7, so the local character of the area, high density development may be acceptable in the town centre. It's subject to a number of caveats, the need to test it in terms of its impact on the townscape and other matters. But again, starting to enshrine in policy this position. Next stop for Solent was the submission of a podium deck application. This was submitted in May and was the forerunner to any redevelopment schemes that may or may not go on top of it. It was touted as being simply the engineering solution for the site, a deck that would run from Mary's Terrace all the way across the existing station entrance, potentially upon which additional development could be put. This podium deck, they've attributed a cost to it that's something in the region of £3 million. That's a number that keeps being referred back to in every viability assessment they undertake. And submitting it in isolation seemed to be a bit of an unusual way to do it because it didn't afford anyone the opportunity to look at the potential for what might go on top. TRAG objected on that point. That's an image that we prepared of the podium there. No particular merit in its own right. The big question remains, what's likely to go on top of it? At the time we didn't know. It's conceivable that a significant quantum of development could go on the top. So what's the point of approving a podium if you don't know what's going to go on the top? And a few images. You'll see there the Travelodge extension to Regal House has started to make an appearance in some of the images. Next point. In October 2010, the station area supplementary planning document was advanced by the council. Reference has already been made to this. It forms a key part of TRAG's objections and TRAG's concerns in relation to the proposals. Very specifically specified appropriate heights for development on the station site and on the post office site. Specifically, those heights there. So 4 to 5 stories in height from Mary's Terrace, 2 to 3 stories in height adjacent to Cole Park Road. This document is a supplementary planning document. It is in itself a material consideration, but relates back and provides guidance in terms of the policies contained in the core strategy that you saw earlier. This is just a quick image to actually show how far off Solent's scheme is at the moment. Next stop, November 2010, the submission of the first main application from Solent. This application was submitted on the 26th of November, but wasn't actually validated until I think it was January or February of the following year, due to some deficiencies in terms of the information that was submitted with it. There's an indication of the massing. I'm sure you're all very familiar with it. It was the height of Regal House, adjacent to Regal House, tailing down to 4 to 5 stories adjacent to the River Crane. You'll see the podium deck is there, the same footprint as the schemes that were advanced in the very early stages, and a bit of the quantum of development has been shown off the top of it. 165 units, new station entrance, but it also included a quantum of affordable housing. Of those 165 units, 28 units were to be affordable. that's something to remember, because it's part of the scheme that disappeared in the subsequent revisions to it. Very clearly in contention with the supplementary planning document, probably to the tune of 5 or 6 stories too high. This application is still in, it's still running. There's been additional information that's been submitted. It hasn't gone away, although we do understand from speaking to officers of the council that it's effectively not being pursued immediately by Southern. It's not likely to be the scheme that goes to committee. That's certainly the advice that we've received. We've prepared some images of it. That's the existing view from Cheltenham Avenue. That's a model view of the impact of the scheme. A little lower. That's fine. Thanks. You'll see the Travelodge extension in there as well, and that's the bulk of the scheme in the view behind. The view from the pedestrian bridge at the station, Regal House looming large, something similar prepared immediately adjacent to it. And I think this is a fair illustration of TRAG's concerns in terms of the scale, height and bulk of the development that's been proposed. Again, it's very clear to see that it doesn't conform with the supplementary planning document that's been issued. Next up, Podium Committee. The application for Podium in isolation that we spoke about earlier was put to Planning Committee at Richmond on the 17th of December 2010. I was in Australia watching the cricket, one of my colleagues attended. But apparently it was a very lively evening. Much discussion, much debate about the prospects of securing just the Podium development. In the end, the committee resolved to defer it while further information was awaited, but a significant amount of the discussion related to the appropriateness of advancing that Podium application in isolation. March 2011, we're starting to